Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. Each week, government executives and thought leaders join me for an informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government effectiveness. These individuals are truly changing the way government does business. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, is getting back to basics, reenergizing its mission of protecting human health and the environment. How exactly is EPA getting back to basics, and what are some of its key strategic priorities? I'll discuss these questions and much more with Henry Darwin, EPA's Chief of Operations. Also joining me from IBM is Kirsten Schroeder. Take a look and take a listen. Download the entire interview at iTunes or at businessofgovernment.org. So before we get into specifics, could you provide us with an overview of the history and evolving mission of the US Environmental Protection Agency, EPA? When was it created, and how has its mission evolved to date?
So the EPA began in the early 1970s. Happened to be very close to my birth date, as a matter of fact. So EPA and I were born very, very close in proximity. But EPA was created as a result of growing concern about some environmental issues that were going on in the country. Rivers on fire being a good example of that. It was a river in Colorado or in Cleveland. I don't remember the exact name of it, but there was just this growing concern, and it's interesting to me as a Republican that the agency actually was born in a Republican administration under President Nixon. And at the time, there was just this growing concern about environmental issues. They were being dealt with in various agencies, but kind of in a piecemeal approach. So there was an intent and a desire with the president working with Congress to establish the agency, and then at the same time to establish some really somewhat innovative means in which to regulate public health and the environment. So it was the creation of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in particular, that really focused the agency's efforts in those areas that the public was really starting to experience a real need for someone to step in, for the government to step in and to do something about it. So that's where it began. Of course, there have been a number of amendments and changes and additions to EPA's mission. But what we found recently is that because of the complexity of the environmental requirements that have been put in place throughout the years, Congress really has a tough time dealing with how it might what they call reauthorize or change the statutes in order to meet today's growing needs. So what's happened over time is that EPA has done what it can in order to fill those gaps or to react to the changing physical environment in which we live. We're living with statutes that were largely written in the 1970s. Lots of change since then, of course. The world's changed since then. So the agency really is faced with this challenge of staying true to the original intent of those authorizing statutes, but also, adapting to the changing physical environment and political environment, for that matter, in the country.
So, Henry, putting that operational capacity in place and changing the culture, it's got to be fraught with some challenges. So I was wondering, could you maybe tell us what your top three management challenges are and how have you sought to address those?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a top three, but one of the biggest challenges that EPA faces is identifying the owners of process. Mm-hmm. With such a large organization and with such a complex mission, it's often difficult to identify the person, the leader, who's responsible for a given process. We'll take an example, the Superfund process. So the Superfund process, Superfund was set in place by Congress to provide a fund to clean up sites for which there was not a viable responsible party that could be found in order to clean up the site, basically historically contaminated sites. It's a very complex process that doesn't take months or years. Usually it takes decades in order to get a site from identification of a need for cleanup to when it's cleaned up and ready for its anticipated use. Finding a person that's responsible for not only a given site, but also for their process in general has been a challenge. The other challenge really has been getting the agency to think about measurement on a more frequent basis. They're used to measuring on a annual or at most a semi-annual basis. The way that I view that as an issue is that when we measure something on an annual or semi-annual basis, we have one, if at most 2 times a year, an opportunity to make course corrections. If we are measuring what we do on a monthly basis, then we have 12 opportunities a year to make changes. And of course, if we do it weekly, we have 52 opportunities a year to make changes. So getting the agency comfortable with this idea that they'll be monitoring their operations, monitoring the work that they do on a more frequent basis, has been somewhat of a challenge because they're not used to it. Those measurements aren't in place. The means by measuring them aren't in place. And then that brings me to the third major challenge. This is a challenge for any government enterprise, and that is, how do we measure our success? Because at its core, any management system is about measuring the success and managing to the success of the organization. In the government context, what we could be measuring to evaluate our success is almost infinitely complex. Whereas the private sector is able to monitor their success by their bottom line, the profits and losses. How do you measure the profits and losses of a government organization? Because what we do is much more than our bottom line. For the EPA, our mission is about protecting public health and the environment. So we need to find a way of measuring our success with respect to protecting public health and the environment. And it's not as easy as it sounds. We're doing our best to try to figure out where those opportunities exist and where we can measure outcomes. But a lot of those outcomes, because of the nature of our work, don't change very frequently. So it's hard for us to see in our day-to-day activities how we're making influence or influencing the outcomes that are important. A great example of that is clean air. So the way we've chosen to measure clean air is by the number of non-attainment areas in the country. A non-attainment area is an area that is not meeting a national ambient air quality standard. So something like lead is a national ambient air quality standard. So if there's a part of the country that's not meeting the lead standard, then that is something that we're counting as part of our measurement. So we currently have 166 areas of this country that are not meeting the national ambient air quality standards. So we've set a goal for ourselves of reducing that number to 101 by 2022. So we want to go from 166 non-attainment areas to 101 non-attainment areas over the next 5 years. So because those non-attainment areas are challenging in order to reverse the pollution that's causing them, we need to find ways of measuring our daily, weekly, and monthly activities so that we can monitor our progress towards meeting those goals that, aren't changed or aren't moving as often as monthly. So that's really a challenge for us, is identifying those things that we want to measure as being important and or to evaluate the success of our organization, but then converting them into things that we can measure on a monthly or even more frequent basis.
Yeah, so you've really described many of the challenges as you're moving to this new operational environment. And one other question kind of here would be, has anything really surprised you in your current role as you've been pushing this new paradigm?
I don't know if it's surprising to me, but it's been incredibly rewarding for me to work with the career staff at EPA who are all there because they believe in EPA's really important mission. And their willingness to listen and their willingness to try to support the work that I've been brought here to do. So it really has been something that I wasn't expecting. I was expecting a lot of resistance, reluctance to change, and there is some of that in the agency, of course. But by and large, they're all willing to work with me and work with this administration on identifying a path forward and moving forward towards a means by which we can achieve our mission while external pressures are being put on us to get smaller as an organization. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably why there is more cooperation or more support for what I'm doing, is because I think that they realize and understand that if we are to continue to succeed in succeed in our mission, that we need to be able to be more effective and efficient in its delivery. And the only way to do that is through some of the principles that the private sector has found to be effective, one example being lean. And lean is something that the agency has been using for some time now, so they're very familiar with it. They know the benefits of the principles behind lean. And so the system is based upon lean principles, but also is specifically designed in order to support lean efforts. So I think that they're looking at this as a kind of a next level of utilizing a lean in the work that they do.
Henry, the EPA's mission, as you pointed out in our previous segment, is protecting human health and the environment. And the latest agency strategic plan really focuses on getting back to what Administrator Pruitt calls back to basics. And first off, would you elaborate on this agenda and specifically identify the three, I believe there's three, overarching goals that frame this agenda?
Sure. So, yes, the administrator has made it clear that he wants the agency to, as he puts it, get back to basics. And what that means, in a nutshell, is that we need to, as an agency, get much, much better at those things that we clearly were given the authority to do and the responsibility to do under the authorizing statutes. So under the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, those various acts that were adopted in order to give EPA its functions and give EPA its mission. What the administrator has said, and I agree with, is that over time, EPA has become much more focused on those areas in which there is some disagreement. Now, I'm not here to argue on one side or the other side of that disagreement, but there has been some disagreement about what EPA has the authority to do or not to do. And what he has said is that rather than arguing about those things and creating a lot of effort associated with those things that are on the margin, that we should go back to seeing whether or not we are doing those things that are clearly within our authority and clearly within our responsibility and getting much, much better at those. And basically reevaluating the effectiveness of EPA in carrying forward those very key core missionary types of activities.
Mm-hmm. Are there three overarching goals?
Well, so we have a strategic plan, and that strategic plan does have three overarching goals. At its base or at its core,
just identify them.
Yeah, sure. It's the rule of law and process.
Okay.
So that really goes back to kind of the back to basics approach of making sure that everything that we do is based strongly and that everything we do is based on the rule of law, that everything is based upon an authorizing statute or authorizing rule, and then also process, which is one of the reasons I'm here. The primary reason I'm here is the lean management system, getting much, much better at the work that we do. So at its base, the strategic plan is about rule of law and process. But we're also talking a lot about, and the strategic plan talks a lot about, how do we do our work? And it's this renewed acknowledgement of the relationship that we have with the states. And we call it cooperative federalism. So as I was mentioning earlier, the vast majority of the environmental work that's done in this country is done by the states. And it's been by design. Congress, when it created the various authorizing statutes, very clearly intended for the states to take on the lion's share of the responsibilities, that EPA would serve in a somewhat of an oversight function. And so what we're doing now, like a lot of other federal agencies, is going back and reviewing our current state of our relationship with the states and reevaluating that partnership to see what role we should be playing and what role the state should be playing. But why are we doing this? We're all doing this for the third goal, and that is our core mission, to improve air quality, provide safe drinking water, make sure their lands are clean, and that the chemicals that exist in the marketplace are safe. So that's what our strategic plan is about, is just making sure that we're doing all the things that we need to do in order to support our core mission.
Mm-hmm. So we go from air, water, and to land, which is what I want to focus on. And you mentioned one of the top priorities for EPA is accelerating the progress around Superfund sites. Henry, could you tell us more about this effort and your overall, how is EPA working to revitalize land and prevent contamination?
So once again, and as you mentioned, our goals around cleanup really are focused on making contaminated sites ready for anticipated use. And what ready for anticipated use means that we want to take contaminated sites and put them back into the economic bloodstream. So we're doing that in a number of ways. The administrator very soon after his arrival at EPA created a task force that was specifically charged with coming up with recommendations to improve the Superfund process, to improve that process where we clean up the most contaminated sites in the country. So there were a number of recommendations that had come from that work that are currently being managed and currently being implemented. So that's just one example, excuse me, of the work that we're doing. Another example is that we're treating these processes just like any other process at EPA. So we're performing the same types of process improvement events that we performed for, I mentioned, the state implementation plan process. We're doing the same thing for the cleanup process.
All right, Henry. So you mentioned earlier the concept of cooperative federalism. You kind of defined it for us. What I want to do is dig a little deeper. And how is this way of approaching the states and localities and the tribes, how is it a departure from the one-size-fits-all regulatory framework? And what are some of the key initiatives you're pursuing or the EPA is pursuing to realize this vision of cooperative federalism? Yeah,
so maybe I start off by saying what cooperative federalism is at its core. And cooperative federalism is recognizing that the environmental work that we do is performed in partnership with the states and localities and to some degree with the tribes. That this isn't all about EPA doing everything. It just simply would be impossible for EPA to do everything. And I think that when Congress adopted the various authorizing statutes, it specifically recognized that there was a role for EPA to play and a role for the states to play in environmental protection. So cooperative federalism at its core is just acknowledging that this is a shared responsibility. Then it's about, how do we define those roles? How do we define EPA's role versus the state's roles in carrying out these very important obligations? And what we found is that when I arrived at EPA and started talking to the various regional offices and program offices about, how do we manage our relationship with the states? What I found is that there wasn't a single answer to that question. That the program certainly had their view of how EPA should be overseeing states' work. The regional offices felt like they had a different way of looking at how they were overseeing the states and what the relationship with the states should be. So there really was a lack of a comprehensive system for managing the relationship with the states. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat states differently based upon their performance, based upon their expertise, based upon their resources, based upon their needs. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that there was no systematic way of evaluating how we should be deploying our resources to support the state's activities. What we found was that it varied. It varied from literally from state to state. Each state's experience with EPA and each state's experience with the relationship with EPA was different. Having been a former state director, I could put myself back in my shoes when I was in Arizona and had my own stories to tell about how I knew I was being treated, my state was being treated differently than our neighbors to the west, California, because of various things on various topics. And that's not what's important. What's important is that there was a differentiation in treatment based upon factors that were not, let's say they weren't quantifiable or subjective. Objective, I should say.
Great. And, you've spent a lot of time now talking about the implementation of the lean management system and how it's used to improve processes that result in measured outcomes. Case in point, you talked a little bit about Superfund remediation processes. Now, kind of looking forward, how would you use lean to prevent future type of crises?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this really goes to the difference between how we're using lean under this administration than had previously been used by EPA. The fact of the matter is that EPA had performed hundreds of lean events, so hundreds of process improvement events over the last decade or so, all with varying degrees of success. But the fact is that there was a clear adoption of the principles associated with lean. There was a clear appreciation for what lean had to offer. What we're doing now differently is that we're using a system that's been specifically designed to identify small problems and resolve small problems before they become big problems. I was talking earlier about visual management. So that is the most important component to our management system, is that when managers can see when an individual project is getting slightly off track, they can resolve the problems associated with that, or help their staff resolve the problems associated with that project getting slightly off track at the time it's getting slightly off track, rather than finding out a year later, 2 years later, that this project that was not in the line sight of the manager had gotten significantly off track, and maybe even months, if not years, off track. So the system has been designed to make sure that both staff and managers and leaders are able to see those small problems, whether it be problems in workflow or being problems in overall performance, whether or not those problems can be resolved at their infancy and before they become huge problems. The fact of the matter is that each and every time I ask about a process or ask how we're doing in a certain part of our operations, I'm surprised by the number of backlogs that we have as an organization. And backlogs meaning those processes that are so behind that we have a backlog of products, services that aren't being met. whether it be permits that need to be performed, whether it's state implementation plans that need to be approved, whether it's inspections that need to be performed, new chemicals that need to be reviewed, existing chemicals that need to be reviewed. The fact of it is that if we aren't monitoring each one of those products or applications as they're going through the process that we expect to meet certain deadlines, if we're not monitoring that closely, they can become big problems over time, and the system's designed so we can see them early.
Federal regulations impose enormous cost on American businesses and working families. Given your perspective, how is the agency seeking to reduce the burden of the regulatory process?
So this is one area where the administrator is leading by example. So he's actually going out and speaking to those that we regulate, listening to them firsthand. And when he hears of regulations or issues that he has heard are overly burdensome or unduly burdensome, he brings it back to the agency for us to evaluate whether or not there's something that we should be doing, whether or not there's something we should be doing about it, while still being protective of public health and the environment.
Be sure to join me next time on the Business of Government Hour TV for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government effectiveness. Until then, it's businessofgovernment.org.